nationalism flavored with a bit of religion, even in the so-called secular schools, while the curriculum of the Palestinian schools where the emphasis was on cosmopolitan, humanist values. And if there was any hint about nationalist discourse, it was to tell the Palestinians why Israel is important to the Jews. So what we found out talking with teachers and so on, that they were using the poetry of Bialik, the Jewish nationalist poet, in order to make sense to the Palestinians some kind of a nationalist sentiments. What we also found, we were working in what today would have been called anti-colonial methodology, and we were working a whole team of researchers with very committed Palestinian students who were giving us access to teenagers in all these villages rather than via the schools. And we found out that before the war, although before and after an Israeli Arab was the most popular self-identification, before the war, quite a few defined themselves as Israeli. This virtually disappeared after the '67 war. Before the war, virtually nobody defined themselves as Palestinian. The emergence of the Palestinian identity started very, very quickly after the war, and of course the whole thing has been quite transformed since then. I'm saying it not only in order to connect what I'm going to say to what has been said before, but also to underline, I think probably against the discourse of the first keynote speech, that, as Donna Haraway said, there is no view from nowhere, that every research, as well as every lecture and any other discourse, is coming from a particular situated gaze with particular underlying values. And I don't think that the school is a suspension from this context. I think the school is exactly, and the textbook and the curriculum that I'm talking about just show how much this is not a neutral space, this is not a suspicion of the outside environment. The Jesuits used to say, give me a little child and I'll produce to you any kind of person that we would like, you would like us to produce. And of course it is true. When I was studying Jewish fundamentalism in London, I heard again and again how much the control, not only of the school, but prohibiting people to watch the television, to read secular newspaper, how much it was vital in order to reproduce the construction of subjectivity from one generation to another. And I don't have to go to this kind of research. My own father was along long lines of rabbis in Lithuania until after First World War, secular state education was introduced there, and this gave him the lever to become secular, to choose a different kind of life. So I think this is something which is very important when we examine the role of education. It is not an alternative to socialization. It's a particular type of socialization. It is something which I differentiate between subjectivities and identities because subjectivities also have unconscious part. But I'll expand what I mean about identity in a minute. But what education does is construct subjectivities in relation to particular what I call political projects of belonging, whether formal or informal. It can belong to a state, but it can belong to a religion or a particular other ideological institution. Now, given that education is so important to this political project of belonging, how does it relate to identity? And later on you will see I'm going to relate it to issues of social inequality. When we are talking, sorry, I'm getting warmed up to the subject. When we are talking about identity, I would like to define it as a form of narrative, of a story, in which people tell themselves and others who they are, and even more important, who they are not. Now, identity is a very contested subject. So contested that some social scientists like Brubaker and Cooper and Florentines and others said, let's leave it. Even Stuart Hall, who is so important in theorization of identity, said, I don't really know what is identity. I don't agree with this. I think as long as we decide to define it very clearly, it is very, very important. And it's also very important that we differentiate it from identity politics, which I'll get back to later on, which I see as particular types of political projects of belonging. Now, the narrative approach for identity, as I said, is that people tell themselves and others who they are and who they are not. Other approaches to identity might seem to be contesting, but I would argue they are complementing the narrative approach, which can also be seen to be implied in them. One very important alternative approach to identity, which was very much developed in sociology by Parsons on the one hand and Goffman on the other hand, and of course later on in different way by Judith Butler following Foucault, is a performative approach to identity. The performative, either through Parsons, that all social life is about role-playing. So it's separate between the self and the role. But when does a role become the person? According to Judith Butler, the role is the person. But Goffman talked about identity as a theater performance, as a text. And indeed, if you go to Judith Butler's anti-humanist approach, you think that the identity narratives are like a text of a play. Different actors can play the same play text and the same narratives. But of course this is very problematic because this takes away the agency from people. Repetition and reiteration gives authority to narrative. The more people and the more time there is repetition, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a Jew, what it is to be a Palestinian, this kind of definition, this kind of narratives gains authority. But we also know, and in her later writings, Judith Butler actually accepted as well, that people also contest definition. There is a lot of contestation. I consider myself an Israeli Jew, but I'm also anti-Zionist. Can there be an Israeli Jew is anti-Zionist? If you look at this text in the school, this is something that is not even possible to articulate. And of course, the same thing happens within feminist Muslim identities, for example. Can be a Muslim woman be a feminist? Again, a completely impossibility. So, in other words, even in the performative approach to identity, we still go back to the issue of narrative, of agency, of the stories that people tell themselves about who they are and who they are not. But what is important is that we can start to see that identity narratives are not individual or collective. They involve both the individual who narrates them and the collective resources from which they absorb, they imply, they select, they contest, they resist about who they are and who they are not, and how they are and how they are not. And in this sense, although the performative approach is very much about how discourses and narratives of identity become reiterated and authorized or resisted, it never asks where these narratives come from. And this is another alternative approach of identity, which is a dialogical approach, very much inspired by Bakhtin, but also by others, and definitely transversal feminist discourse is very important, but I'll come back to that later. The dialogical approach means that involves what we call a dialogical epistemology, because it is not that we just accept collective narratives. We also add to them. We also select them and reinforce and authorize some of them, and also resist some of them and authorize counter-narrative and counter-discourses. And this is why there is a dialogical epistemology. Patricia Hill Collins, a very known black feminist, talked about the impossibility to express the truth, but that you can approach the truth by a dialogical process. The old kind of metaphor of four blind men who are asked to describe an elephant. One touched the tail, one touched the trunk, one touched the ear, one touched the leg. Each of them, when they're asked to describe an elephant, describe something very different. But if they discuss among themselves, if they don't see that their description of the elephant are zero-sum game, either they are right or the other one are right, but they are trying to complement what is an elephant by listening to all of them, they can approach the truth of what is an elephant. Of course, never completely reach it. Even 100 blind women and men kind of touching an elephant, there might be some bits that are missing. But this is what the feminist standpoint epistemology is all about. It claims that each of us has a situated gaze at a particular social situation. It is not a relativist epistemology. It doesn't say, like some anthropologists, which say, oh, this is their culture, and therefore this is their truth. And this is, of course, like in Britain, for example, there were women who escaped Iran after the revolution because they didn't want to cover their head. It was their right. They saw it as an individual kind of choice. But and they claimed refuge because they were threatened by violence if they will not cover their heads. And the judge said, this is your culture. Therefore, we are not going to offer you refuge, although you are persecuted, although this supposedly follows the legal kind of demand of what is to be a refugee. But one role to Western women, one role to Iranian women. So in this sense, this is a relativist point of view. But dialogical epistemology of standpoint says no. But it does not cancel the view of the other. Any kind of a valid, not just research, but a political dialogue or whatever, respect as long as one understands that one is speaking the way that they see or understand the situation, respect how the world is actually seen and try to listen to it and try and see that the situation is looked very different from different situated gazes. I mean, it was interesting to listen to the Swedish kind of attempt to include both point of view supposedly, but it wasn't only supposedly because it was mediated via a particular kind of Eurocentric kind of interpretation, which of course respected what they knew of the history of European Jews and was very much part of the Orientalist kind of tradition of what were the people in the Middle East, including the Palestinian history. Now, there are two kinds of before I put it, it is very important then to talk about dialogical epistemology. At the same time, it's also very important to understand that this dialogue is not constructed by equal contribution of each participant to the product, to the narrative of identities and other kind of social discourses that are coming out. Some people have louder voices than others. Some people have more articulation, more educational resources, and other kind of cultural, economic, political resources. And sometimes, as we remember in kind of various NGOs or in other international conferences, whoever has the hardest bottom to stay till 4 o'clock in the morning awake in order to write the narrative, which is going to be the declaration where other people gave up and went to sleep. So it doesn't have to, there are a variety of difference. But it does mean that all these narrative discourses of identity and any other social encounters are embedded in unequal power relations. That when we talk about dialogue, we have to not only recognize the validity of other situated gazes, but also to recognize and to respect that there are unequal power relations among the participants. Of course, school is one of the exemplary kind of situation in which the most democratic kind of teachers can only pretend that these are egalitarian social relations, but of course they are not. In other words then, identity politics, is it okay now? Okay. Identity politics try to homogenize identities and very often to elevate one identity above others. And they also collapse the individual and the collectivity and the social category altogether. As a woman, I can tell you, as a Jew, I can tell you, as a Palestinian, I can tell you, really? All women are the same? All Israeli or Jews who are not Israeli are the same? All Palestinians are the same? In other words, when we are talking about identities, this is one dimension of belonging, which other dimension of them is the social economic positioning, which will be different, but also different normative values. Yes, I identify as a woman, and I'm a socialist feminist. She also identifies as a woman, but she doesn't identify herself as feminist. There is relations, but not identification between the different dimensions. And of course, being a woman, if you are young or old, in different stages of the life cycle, from different ethnicity or nationality or race, education, rural, urban, sexuality, ability, etc. In other words, the meaning of particular identities, the meaning of particular narratives about identities always should be seen as constituted by the different constructions of different social categories or hierarchies of power. I don't have time to develop now more about intersectionality. I'm giving a lecture about it in Jerusalem on Thursday, but I think it's very important when we talk about identities that we understand that identity politics, which homogenize identities, is a political project, but it is not a description of social reality. And this is very, very important. Now, to come back to education, I mean, the relationship between self and others, which identity relates to, also should not be homogenized. The relationship between self and non-self very often has been described as a relationship between self and others. This dichotomous approach is very problematic in many different ways. For example, psychoanalytics will tell you that self and others are included also within you. My mother died 40 years ago. I still have arguments with her. This does not mean that it's division between self and non-self is only external. It's also internal. But externally, there are different types of relationship. First of all, the relationship between me and us. As psychoanalysts, and especially people like Lacan and so on, talk about the mirror moment in which the self become differentiated, perceives herself or himself to be differentiated from the other, is absolutely crucial to the development of the self, as well as, of course, of self-identity. But particular identities would differ in the relationship between me and us. The most extreme relationship of between me and us, not as completely separate, is when parents sacrifice their lives for their children, or people from a particular nation or religion or whatever sacrifice themselves. In this sense, the survival of the physical separate self become secondary to the continuous of the collective self, which will exceed and continue the biological self. So this is a very different kind of model than the neoliberal one, which talk about the supremacy of greed and selfishness, and that you don't owe anything to anybody. But also, when you move from me and us to them, there can be different relationship. Of course, in extreme situation in which people die, there is it's like a zero-sum game. It's either us or them in terms of identity relations. But in most situations, there is many different kinds of them. Move says that agonistic friendly enemies are vital for the existence of democracy. And if we look, when we conduct research on everyday life of people, we see that there is banalization of others. It can be convivial, it can be agonistic, but, you know, in pluriversal, like a metropolitan city like London, different people live many different kind of style of life. They go about their own way. Sometimes they interact, some not. And there is a very clear conscience that this is them rather than us, but it is not either us or them. So there are many different relationships then between me and us. And these relationships are absolutely crucial when we look at the role of education in terms of constructions of identity. Because what we have heard about the textbook, what we have heard about the whole kind of narratives which are being perpetuated in this school, is that there is no space to them if there is space for us. It's a zero-sum game. Even if not biological annihilation, inferiorization, marginalization, exclusion is absolutely vital in order for us to continue to exist. This is one extreme. The other extreme, which we experience to our cost very much in British universities and so on, is the neoliberal corporatization of universities and schools and society in general, in which what we are told is that the only important thing is if you can bring money, if you can bring students, if you can, anything that you do will apply, I think. So then it's just kind of the me, and any collective civil space, the interest of anybody else is completely irrelevant. So obviously education reflects wider hegemonic values in society. I'm just finishing even before 5 minutes. But, and therefore it is not a given. But because, as I said, all social relations are embedded in power, it's not enough. I was very naive in '67 when we did this research. I thought, if we just expose what is happening, it's going to disappear. And here we are in how many years after? And things are, if not worse, are the same. So education and voluntarist change is, as somebody said, the word utopia. But as a political, analytical, even scientific strategy, let's look for some kind of power lever to change it according to the value we want to, but not just think that wishful thinking, lovely cosmopolitan values are going to solve the issues. Thank you very much.